Okay, hello everybody. I am Brigitte Baptiste from Humboldt Institute, and I'm pleased to be here with you to talk about a bit biodiversity in the science policy interface. The idea would be to talk about the experience that I have within Humboldt as well as in ATBC, which is the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and perhaps in some other science policy interfaces, which I'm going to talk a bit more now. The idea of a science policy interface emerged some years ago to describe particular bodies of experience, particular institutions and persons that are working explicitly to bring the results of scientific endeavor to the decision makers. There was the agreement that it was necessary to not just modify the language, but also to distill, to identify and highlight the main results of the scientific work towards decision making. And this is particularly important in terms of conservation, in terms of biological management of natural resources, because there's plenty of economic implications of any decision, and to make sure that everybody understands what are the consequences of these decisions, it's important to really connect very well the knowledge with the decision. But science policy interfaces are really a new thing. We have experience on connecting governments with the academy, but not in such a strong way. And that's why I titled this slide "A New Breed." Kind of, we are talking of new species in the ecosystem. I think that it deserves a bit more of discussion on how they work, why are they important, and how we can improve their development and their role to reach governments, to reach those decision makers that sometimes are not in the government. So I'm going to talk a bit about the scientific advisory bodies that many countries have, that many organizations, in particular multilateral agreements, have developed, and how it's evolving this idea of science policy interfaces. I won't read any of the slides. I will try to let you do that, but of course you'll have them afterwards. Usually, governments have in the past assembled commissions or panels or particular types of teams, have created missions and task forces for helping them to understand a particular situation. They have designed persons as counselors, they have chosen advisors. In general terms, they have sorry for the grammar, for expertise, sometimes in-house expertise, local people, members of the government or nearby, or people far away from them. For example, today I was called by the Ministry of Agriculture, and he asked me to explain better why we should not allow some introductions of species as agricultural crops or as aquaculture fishes. And I had a long talk with him. I showed lots of the reports about the risks of invasions. And at the end, he asked me to assemble a small task force to build scenarios for the use of different species as sources of aquaculture. Therefore, I am assembling that, and I'm helping the government to do that. And clearly with the idea to report in 90 days about some of the main results of that inquiry. That's great. It's nice that governments count on science, count on academy, count on other people to take decisions. But a bit ironically, I say also that usually they ignore those reports, or they fire, expel the executive and executive history. There's plenty of times when scientific has been, a scientist has been so uncomfortable with its truth, with its inconvenient truth, that has been executed or ignored or expelled from the community. But sometimes governments and decision makers express their gratitude, but always they use that accordingly some bounded rationality. Governments never accept or take for granted all the results, advertisement, advice, or counseling that the science provides. Usually they take their time, they think twice, and they discuss a bit more on the political implications and risks for themselves if they go one side or the other of the decision. The success of this goes parallel with the complexity of the issue and the willingness to really take action. This picture portrays the killing of the Francisco José de Caldas, the execution in 1816, when the Spanish took over Colombia and the new realm of Nueva Granada, and they killed all the scientists that were working already for the new republic. And even if they were considered very wise persons, the first generation of academics in the republic, the Spanish, they said, Spain doesn't need local scientists, local wise men, and then they killed them all. So we have a beginning of those interfaces of a very sad beginning for those bodies. Then it took a long history to really create new types of interaction between scientists and the decision makers. And there's a nice role for Humboldt, and I bring him here because he was quite important for Colombian history, but also for America and Europe, and for history of science. Humboldt visited the Orinoco, visited Colombia, and he gave advice to the Viceroy in 1801, and he was very important to provide information about the biodiversity and the richness of nature in our country. He even described many new species, also with the Mebon plant, and even being a German, well, at the time was a Prussian, the Spanish crown accepted many of his advice, being another country, being an outsider. But with time, history has proven that Humboldt played a very important role in terms of politics, because when he came back to Europe, he talked to Simón Bolívar, and he provided him with lots of inspiration and political ideas about independence, about becoming, kicking away the Spanish from our land. So this a piece of thinking about when and how scientists play a role that is not just scientific, and we have to really become very aware that even if we have results, robust results, rigorous processes, we have important science behind, we always are persons, we always are citizens, and we need to declare where are we sitting in terms of ideology, which is our history, in order for governments, in order for society to know better how to judge our own contributions to knowledge. In general terms, those policy science interfaces produce documents, produce results that are weighed on paper. Could be policy briefs, policy papers, scientific editorials in journals. Could be also commissioned reports, SPMs or summaries for policymakers, and products for media. This is kind of particular type of communication devices for the science policy interfaces, because it's different for science that publishes on journals or books that are especially oriented to the academy. Here I portray three types of policy documents produced by scientists in the most recent years. One is from the IPCC report on climate change and global warming, especially addressed to decision makers at cities, majors and bodies of government in cities. There's the TEEB, which is the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity Assessment, which is a summary of all the recommendations to make or to build ecological economics at any country. And then the last one of major importance is the Regional Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services for the Americas, which was produced by IPBES. And you can go to the website of IPBES or the other two platforms and download those reports. And you'll see that there's a small summary, the small amount of contributions that people do to the audiences, but also there's lots of annexes and information that compiles the sources or the comprise all the information that drive the recommendations or the findings or whatever the commissions wanted to bring to the policymakers. And usually those reports are very short. They are written in a particular language. They take into account the need for specific information. They try to convey a very specific idea. So they became science policy reports with their own identity. They reveal their capacity. I have 3 examples of science policy interfaces, which are, one is the IPBES, it's the global level. The other is the III, the Inter-American Institute for Global Change, which is the regional scale for the continent. And there's the Institute of Humboldt, which I work in for the at the national level. I'm not aware of that type of institutions at the local level, but I'm sure there are many. Also, there are sectorial types of commissions or platforms. Those are particularly designed for conservation, for biodiversity, for climate change, and that's why I choose them. Those interfaces, they have some attributes that I listed here, and I think that we can, or you can discuss after that, after reading them, how any other type of platform you may think as a particular science policy interface agrees with them or complies with them. But the most important thing for an interface is that kind of clear rules of engagement, how the experts became part of a body of discussion with enough autonomy, but also enough restrictions for to provide their advice. So this is quite important, and also usually the science policy interfaces need a conceptual framework. They have to declare from which part of theory they are talking about. In conservation, we can say we are talking with island biogeography. We are talking with a genetic perspective of evolution, whatever. But we have to declare in terms that any person understands how are they linked to research, how are they linked to knowledge production. There are other science policy interfaces that we know very well, such as the Convention of Biological Diversity, the Convention for Climate Change, the Convention for Trade and Endangered Species, some of the symbols there. But conventions by themselves, they are not SP interfaces, but because they do not provide science to decision makers, but they invite the science and decision makers to join in the same room, discuss and agree something. I think that the IPBES is much more science policy interface because it does the scientific work and it does the political discussion of the results. This is the conceptual framework for IPBES. You can find it published in Current Opinion in Environmental Sustainability. It has undergo lots of discussion, but which is important is that for the purposes of the platform, the global platform, there's a selection of issues that the governments will ask the scientists to contribute with in certain way. So the 132 countries that are part of the platform ask the academic community and all type of experts to help them with ideas about the relation of nature, with nature's benefits to people, in order to understand better the good quality of life or the human well-being. And in the middle, to understand the role of anthropogenic assets, institutions, governance, drivers of change, and at the end of the cycle there at different scales. So this framework provides kind of the mandate from the governments to the scientist or to the expert, not just scientists, to clarify. And in that sense, the best frames the needs and the scope of the job that the academy has to do. In Colombia, we have, as I mentioned before, Instituto Humboldt, which was created more or less in the same way than IPBES, but just at the national level 25 years ago. And Humboldt Institution has also a mandate that comes from the national policy for the biodiversity management, the national policy for biodiversity management, yes, the national policy of climate change, and the national policy for risk management. And there's a bit also from the national policy of innovation and science for development. So there's quite some mandates that are translated into a particular a document that creates Humboldt Institute, saying that or claiming that understanding that we should understand biodiversity and ecosystem services as the basis of well-being, so that we adopt certain way of seeing and addressing it. We also understand or highlight where is kind of the most important process behind biodiversity conservation, which is land use change in this case. And they also suggest an integral perspective for conservation that assembles knowledge, preservation, restoration, sustainable use, and risk management as the source of agreements for adaptation. And I will develop a bit more, I will expand a bit more those issues. Sorry, a bit of water. Okay. And so this is to show how science policy interfaces also act as exchange devices for different types of governance systems. So like I mentioned before, the Humboldt Institute was born as a requirement of the environmental policies in Colombia, but also of the scientific policies and the risk management policies. Of many trends of management, land management, of knowledge management, and decision making. Make us a science policy interface, but it will give us enough room to design the programs and the approach that Humboldt has to do towards decision making related to biodiversity. This picture is the first meeting of the National Environmental Council that was created also in 1995, and it's kind of the, it is the body that rules over Humboldt and over all environmental planning in Colombia. It's presided by it's chaired by the president and the Minister of Environment and many other ministers and authorities. And it's our umbrella institutional institution. Then we are part of the national environmental system. Sorry for this slides in Spanish, but I don't have them in English, but there are some guidelines to read them afterwards. So what it says is that we are somewhere in the environmental system. So we are part of a much more wider institutional arrangement. And within this institutional arrangement, there's also private sector, universities, NGOs, territorial entities such as governments, regional governments, municipalities, the Air Force, the military, majors. Well, that's almost a system that we have to take into account when designing our task. Usually, science policy interfaces work with maps, conceptual maps that locate very well where each institution is, that they identify their connections with the rest of the institutions. This is one sort of a map. There are many other ways, but here you see the small green symbol up into your left, which says Instituto Humboldt. There are other pink, blue, and green, yellow labels, which account for other similar institutions in Colombia. And then there's plenty of arrows and relations written to locate the place, to identify to identify the place where we should be. Also, as a science policy interface, we have to create, to provide the government with a plan of action. So with this bounded mandate, we suggest steps to comply with the international agreements and with the national requirements for protecting biodiversity, and therefore we are part, or we are coordinators of this National Action Plan of Biodiversity. Many countries have them. Some of them are made by the government directly. Some of them are made by a consultant. Some of them are made by a university. In this case, the plan is made by us as a science policy interface, which means that we invited all the other actors to sit together during 3, 4, 6 months and discuss the priorities and actions needed to preserve biodiversity. This is quite important because it follows the idea that biodiversity is not managed just by one section of the government, it's not managed by one section of the society, one portion of the society, but it's almost everywhere that biodiversity is part of the agricultural activities, is part of the infrastructure development activities, is part of the urban growth plans, and so on. So biodiversity is everywhere, and everybody should be participating into their management. There's a role for the government, of course, but there's a role for indigenous communities, a role for rural communities, for peasants, for everybody there. So this is a huge list of some of the part of the framework that we assembled for that discussion. Policy interface means that you don't necessarily produce new knowledge, but the discussion to give people enough material to yes, about what's happening in Colombia related to deforestation, what's happening with the Amazon, what's happening with our capacity to design scenarios for the future, what's happening with adaptation in the coast, and there are many, many issues that we selected and we put on the table for everybody to discuss. There are some main issues identified and organized also accordingly the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and at the end you get a plan that is much better in terms of integrity than if it would have done by other means. So we have we have 7 axes, 7 big activities that we have to develop, and programs that are specific to each of them. So this is also in Spanish. I'm sorry, I will mention a couple programs in the last column. It says that ancestral knowledge and cultures valued, knowledge systems integrated into the management of biodiversity, responsible production, adaptive institutions, agreements for land planning, consumers aware of their role in biodiversity management, functional ecological networks, sustainable ways of life, and surroundings adapted to climate change. There are some of the actions that come from this discussion. But of course, we have a very particular condition in Colombia that also bounds our activities, and this is kind of the acknowledgement of the non-written policies. And I think this is half of the picture, because we have all the formal institutions, the formal planning, all the legal conditions of any country, and also you have the informal, the legal, which in some countries, such as ours, are very important. So we cannot ignore, and in particular because they have a huge influence on conservation, a huge influence on the species management, and also in the capacity of the state and the society to address those challenges. And there's lists here. We have illegal armies, illegal crops, illegal mining, population displacement, informal urban growth, a very bad human rights situation, which is now a bit better, but it's not good at all. Unemployment, informal economy in our terms. So there's a bit of a mess that comes from this side of the coin. You have a map with the numbers of anti-personnel mines, explosives that are really a threat for everybody, and that also limit most of the activities for biology, for natural resource management, even for ecotourism in the country. So we are spending lots of money trying to get rid of those mines. Fortunately, because we already signed the peace agreement, but still they affect our mobility and affect our capacity to do things. Then we also have a very known issue, which is sadly again coming back, which is illegal crops, mostly coca for the production of cocaine. Not the only ones. You have dots for the coca expansion in Colombia during the last 20 years, and we are losing 100 and 150,000 hectares of forest because of coca production every year. And coca production, of course, is made by illegal forces. It's protected by illegal armies. It's plenty of a source of corruption. So it's really hinders the capacity of governance of the country. Coca is not the only illegal crop, since we already have lots of laws to land use planning. There's also oil palm, illegal oil palm. There's also illegal rice crops. There's also illegal potato crops, because they are located in very sensitive ecosystems where the law doesn't allow them. But also we lack the capacity for enforcing those types of crops. During the last 10 years, 20 years, let's say, and the conflict, there's lots of population displacement, and this means that in many regions there's very little local people, that in most cases the elders have gone, or they are not able to participate anymore into research, into traditional knowledge recovery, and most of the local knowledge is being lost. 7 million of people displaced, which makes Colombia the second largest country in expelling population towards cities after Sudan. Probably Venezuela now is doing something similar. We also have illegal gold mining, mostly gold mining, also coal, also other emeralds a bit, but gold mining is becoming absolutely a huge problem. It's destroying rivers, polluting everything with mercury, and it's one of the worst sources of environmental destruction, of deforestation also, and species destruction. So even the efforts of the army and the legal system, it's very difficult to control illegal gold mining, because it produces a huge amount of money. Gold is not illegal, on the contrary of coca, which is illegal. Colombia exports 50 tons of gold every year, but those are official numbers, very poorly built. We also have a bit of terrorism as inheritance of the previous conflict, armed conflict, and this terrorism is particularly bad with the environment. There's lots of bombing of oil pipes, and with the corresponding spilling of oil in rivers. This year we have, until today, 22 types of these attacks, and this creates lots of environmental impact. Lots of land use conflicts, even if the land is used under legal terms. There's very bad planning in the agricultural sector in Colombia. Lots of water waste, pollution, agrotoxic agrochemicals, overuse, and very inefficient ecological outcomes. We have 40 million hectares for 20 million cows, and even the producers acknowledge that the relation should be the opposite. 40 million cows in 20 million hectares. And we have very little forest production, being Colombia a country which should produce lots of wood products. We don't do that. There's very little wood planted, and deforestation is, on the contrary, very, very bad. We are losing capacity to feed our people because of environmental destruction, erosion, and the increased costs of production. And for good and for bad, we are using export revenues of oil and even coca to buy food. So there's a negative incentive to produce food. Deforestation is becoming very, very bad, even after the conflict. There's a struggle for the lands that were freed after regional struggle. And then you see in the map all the red spots that are really being destroyed. 260,000 hectares last year and increasing. And the government has announced lots of measures, but until now, we have been unable to stop this process, which is due to land grabbing, to cocaine plantation, and even to gain rights over oil and mining titles and resources. And of course, after 50 years war, there's lots of people claiming justice and claiming rights violations. So these people is being acknowledged with compensation, but this compensation will take years to complete, and it's going to be very difficult and complicated. We are struggling with that, and there's lots of crimes still going on, hindering the capacity of the state to provide justice. So there's still very complex situations at the local level to do any environmental planning, to do conservation, to do our job. But there's also opportunities. You see this, here's the map. More than a third of Colombia is owned by indigenous and Black communities, and usually those communities protect biodiversity because they are on their they're very important for their livelihoods. So they are kind of allies of conservation, not everywhere at every moment. Gold mining is really in the middle of that, because even if the local communities don't want mining, there's somebody from the outside that will press the local people to allow mining. But there's also a huge national park system, which is in green. There are proposals for peasant reserves. That means a conservation by local rural communities. Also, there are proposals to create many other types of conservation conservation options, conservation figures. Some, by example, owned by the oil companies or managed by the oil companies. Some companies are offering to take care of big chunks of forest on the name of the nation, and with the surveillance of the environmental authorities. This will create kind of a conservation zones for the future as the result of oil extractive industry. Could be part of the compensation, but in most cases they are not considered compensation, but just good practices. there's proposals from large owners of the land to also use land for industrial agriculture, but also with a bit of conservation. At least we are insisting to work together to design landscapes and to avoid the disaster of the soybeans production in Brazil, Paraguay, or even Bolivia. And they are becoming sensible to that. Of course, not to the point we are suggesting, which is half and half, half conservation, half production, but we are more or less in the 70-30 proportion, mostly to preserve wetlands, some particular types of forests, and even hotspots for ecosystem services provision. So this is a dialogue. This is something that is becoming important in Colombia. And then we can summarize some of the management challenges for Humboldt. We are, as the result of this X-rays, we understand that our role as research and policy entity has to evolve and to move ahead from pure conservation towards more negotiating conservation. Perhaps I'm not sure how it sounds in English, but we have to negotiate with the rest of the society. In one side, to convince them that they can get profit and well-being by preserving ecosystem services, but on the other hand, to convince them that biodiversity is going to be important for adaptation for climate change, it's going to be important for future economies, and it's going to be important for everybody. So this situation, there's a bit of self-interest in economics, there's a bit of ethics, and this is something that may open a wider way to work with people that usually are not aware or interested into working with biodiversity. So there's a list of things that we are doing now, we are studying, we are talking to in order to protect biodiversity in a country that cannot protect everything within a protected area. We cannot provide enough protection outside of the system protected areas. There's many policy instruments that we have designed and are designing, and those policy instruments are the result of these dialogues from within the scientific community, but also with the policymakers. So those are the agreements that we need to reach. Sometimes, as a scientist, it's uncomfortable to accept certain levels of ecosystem transformation or of ecological change, but also we have to acknowledge that there are other actors in the society that they don't share our view, they don't, even if we educate them, they won't go along our ideas because there's selfishness or there's short-sightedness, or also we may be wrong. Of course, that has happened in many occasions. But some results of this negotiation are quite important, and some of them are listed here. Even mining companies are accepting no-go zones. There's agreements to focus on ecosystem restoration with money from taxes and the royalties of mining companies. There are all other options for conservation related to the role of those oil or mining companies, new types of protected area, IUCN type to create better information about the levels of ecosystem threats. So we are getting as a result not just the policy interface, the science policy interface, but also huge networks of very different institutions working all together, sometimes with very different perspectives, sometimes even in the opposite side of the table, but being able to negotiate and accept they have a role and they can play a positive role with at no cost or with some gains. So usually we start with academic institutions, but then we move with NGOs. We go more to some companies, private sector, and then we can probably reach other more isolated or stubborn actors. We provide information to everybody. We do lots of knowledge management to show potential outcomes of the of scenarios of no action, or scenarios of no action taken, scenarios of some action taken, or some other scenarios. We invite people to assess those scenarios, and part of the answer in the science policy interface is to really become transparent, to allow everybody to participate into the exercises, the academic exercises that reveal the risks of taking a particular pathway. So we did this for the National Oil Company in the past, which was a map for systematic conservation planning. And this is a map that helps the company to identify places where they should take particular care. And it helps them to reduce costs, to reduce also their what we call social license, reputational risk, but also thinking on transition to more sustainable energy sources, because Ecopetrol is a big company that is 70 years old, and they want to be and stay here for the next 100 years. So they are not completely resistant to ideas of sustainability. Then some examples, other examples that we are providing to decision makers. There's some contributions to the identification and the delimitation of the high mountain ecosystems to protect water sources. And by this, we have worked 3 years, and we handle the government lots of information materials to protect at least 3 million hectares of all the paramounts in Colombia. We are becoming, I think, very successful with this process, adding a different type of conservation than protected areas to the numbers in the country. But we also work towards rediscovering wetlands for flooding management. This was a work made for the National Authority on Risk and Adaptation Management, and we provided the first good quality map of wetlands, the first good quality typology of wetlands for Colombia, of course, but are now being published in the most important journals of the world, because the work is becoming really useful for decision makers. You see a map that indicates very well the risk of flood, but also helps understand how flooding is part of the ecological cycle of the ecosystem, and we have plenty of biodiversity associated with wetlands. We work as a science policy interface also with communities to really make sure that we are able to go to the farthest, to reach the farthest place on the country, to talk to the last peasant, to the last inhabitant of the territory, and get a bit of his opinion, her opinion, a bit of their knowledge and ways of understanding the ecosystem, and bring that to the additional task to assemble more knowledge. So this is a question of equity. Everybody has the right to really participate on the decisions that the state makes about their livelihoods and how their economic or other political policies may affect their ability to stay in the land. So at the end, a good science policy interface will help us to recover governance and governability, because it's a process, or it's a kind of institution that improves communication, that improves discussion and public engagement in debate, that acknowledges the capacity of different stakeholders. Nobody has the same capacities to participate, but we can all participate. So we can use a frame of interculturality. We can invite people that are not part of the scientific community. And we also can be more flexible on the way we assemble and build new institutions and even laws. So there's, I think, an interesting landscape in terms of innovation, and we are building options that may help to, I think, to rescue the role of states and nations that have become so inefficient and very entangled for delivering conservation results. Perhaps because democracy is a very complicated system to take decisions, long-term decisions and stable decisions in periods of time larger than 4 or 5 years. Perhaps because the world is moving towards very different ways of defining participation, rights, and society. I'm not sure, I'm not a sociologist, but what I'm sure is that we are contributing to fulfill a function that the state is not anymore in position to deliver beyond being alone. And therefore, we can increase the capacity of the society to manage biodiversity for sustainability. Those are kind of the products that we bring to the government. I mentioned at the beginning that usually science policy interfaces provide different types of reports. Those are our reports: biodiversity, the status and trends of biodiversity year after year. So to identify what's happening. There's plenty of information in each of these reports. They are all open access. They are assembled by not just our people at the Instituto at Humboldt, but in many universities. And they are also used to report to the CBD every 4 years about how are we advancing on the completion of the IET targets. I'm sorry. It's quite important for that purpose to build a knowledge management platform, and we are, I think, very good at that. An open access information system. We also are creating free tools for biodiversity and big data management. We are creating scenarios for citizen science, for participatory science, creating special reports for sectors. Now we are finishing the first national report on mining and biodiversity. And it's not the job of Humboldt, it's the job of many experts that have been invited by the Ministry of Environment, and we help them to assemble the final report. And I also already mentioned the decision-making support system for companies, and of course, everything needs to be carefully crafted in a communication strategy. This is the National System of Biodiversity Information. Is constructed by more than 100 entities working together and connected through the networks, to the websites. And what they provide is content integration, data integration, information technologies, participatory science, and the ability to develop some particular products and services. Our system works as a network of networks, and we have plenty of available information also linked to the GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility under Creative Commons license. You can go there and understand how do we assemble such an amount of information which is available for everybody. I insist. We gather data from every institution, but nobody loses track on ownership of this data. We put those data on the same format. We assure the quality of those data, and then we use them to provide particular types of information. There are some numbers, and they are not they are a bit outdated. It says 79 partners. Now there's more than 100. The data portal we have 4.4 million biological data published. Now we are around 6 million at the end of this month. There's a national catalog for biodiversity, so just species by species list. We think that Colombia has 65,000 species, more or less. And there's reports of participatory science, observations provided by a naturalist to the system. This has increased exponentially since the first year. As an example of some things that are not working well, and is the capacity to report biodiversity on the national parks. Because national parks are older than the environmental monitoring systems and information systems, we don't have the information with the same level of accuracy than for the rest of the country about biodiversity living in national parks. So you see there's just one list of species coming from one national park and 1,000 biological records. So that's nothing compared with the real numbers that we should be reporting soon. But this is becoming much better, and national parks administration has become part of the national system of biological information. This is an example of one tool that we developed, which is called biomodels, and it's a tool to model distributions, patterns of distribution of species with some algorithm and ecological reasoning behind that to try to forecast the extension of the distribution of any species. And until now, we have modeled almost 6,000 species. This is an open type of collaborative platform. Everybody can download data and use the program to model their own species. Then we have the Bond in a Box toolkit for improving the capacity for biodiversity conservation. And the box contains almost 100 of different types of modeling, monitoring, interpreting tools for biodiversity. What we do on a daily basis, so I'm almost finishing, is to bring advice and guidance for complex decision-making related with biodiversity. There's some for examples there. We also feed the Colombian system of information on biodiversity, and which is knowledge management platform. We report the status and trends of biodiversity, and we do lots of work with publication and events, outreach results. Some screenshots of projects, and I won't go far with them because we are almost on time. But so why and how are we linked to companies, to local governments? We are in the middle of many things, and this is a list of some of our main partners. And if you look closely, even if you don't know Colombian politics, you probably can do that in any country. There's private companies which are completely opposed by radical NGOs and are questioned by government agencies, or because they don't follow the official policies. So we are trying to provide capacities to deal or to transition to a different type of biodiversity management system that is not just located on the natural sciences, not located just on a environmental sector. This is our last proposal for the government, which is are being studied as a source of planning for the whole country, and is being proposed to the CBD as the Colombian way of understanding biodiversity management for the future. So thank you very much for your kind attention. I hope you